All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today we're unpacking Mary Wollstonecraft's incredibly passionate 18th century argument about how society systematically limits human potential. We're looking directly at Chapter 4 of her groundbreaking work, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which really digs deep into the forces that shape our societal roles. And what's absolutely fascinating here is how she frames her argument. She's not just airing a grievance, she is delivering a rigorous philosophical critique of how society actually molds the human mind. Specifically, she's looking at how society tends to elevate fleeting emotions, which she calls sensibility, way over grounded logical reason.
Here is our roadmap for navigating this dense historical text. First, we'll look at the state of degradation. Second, we'll contrast reason versus sensibility. Third, we'll examine the trap of pleasure. Fourth, we'll explore a surprising comparison to the aristocracy. And finally, we'll look at building a foundation for true virtue.
Starting with Section 1, the State of Degradation, or the 18th century Gilded Cage. Wollstonecraft kicks things off with a pretty controversial premise. She argues that women are kept in a state of degradation by societal circumstances. Essentially, they're forced to trade their human potential for a very superficial kind of comfort. And she captures this beautifully in a vivid quote, saying, "Confined then in cages, like the feathered race, they have nothing to do but to plume themselves and stalk with mock majesty from perch to perch." It's quite the image, right? Human beings reduced to decorative birds, just fluffing their feathers. She points out that women are exalted like these short-lived queens. They get food, they get clothing, and they don't have to toil for it. But in exchange for this pampered confinement, they're surrendering their health, their liberty, and most importantly, their virtue.
Because, society basically teaches from infancy that a woman's power, her scepter, is just her beauty. And that results in this artificial homage rather than any genuine respect. Instead of asserting their birthright of independence as rational, thinking creatures, women are encouraged to just enjoy the present moment. They end up relying on what Wollstonecraft calls an arbitrary, insolent respect for men. And the dynamic is deeply ironic. Men pay this outward homage, they treat women like sovereigns, but simultaneously, they despise the very weakness they are cherishing. Women are taught to secure power through their charms, which just makes them completely dependent on the very people who ultimately look down on them.
Moving right along to Section 2, Reason versus Sensibility. Let's demystify these terms. To really get to the core of her argument, we have to pull apart these two distinct concepts. First up, we have reason. Now, according to the text, reason is the simple power of improvement, of generalizing ideas, and of discerning truth. It's the absolute only foundation upon which true virtue can actually be built. Wollstonecraft describes reason as the stamina of immortality. It's the heavy, grounding anchor of the human mind, the very tie that connects the creature to the creator. Cultivating this power, being able to draw comprehensive conclusions from individual observations, well, that's what she argues makes an immortal being truly human.
Then, on the flip side, we have sensibility. And she defines this as a quickness of sensation and perception. It's this exquisitely polished instinct that basically makes you a slave to your senses. Sensibility is light, it's airy, and it's fleeting. Wollstonecraft actually describes a person governed by sensibility as a weathercock, just blown about by every momentary gust of feeling. It's this overstretched reliance on emotion that actively relaxes the other stronger powers of the mind.
Think about the profound divergence between these two forces. On one hand, reason represents strength, foundation, calm investigation, and progressive views. On the other hand, sensibility is all about fragility, wavering opinions, inflamed passions, and contradictory emotions. Wollstonecraft writes that women are classed with the smiling flowers that only adorn the land. By focusing their entire education on sensibility rather than reason, society ensures they remain these fragile creatures, guided entirely by contradictory emotions rather than steady, calm deliberation.
Which brings us to Section 3, the trap of pleasure, and how society limits human potential.
So how exactly does society build this trap? How does it relax the mind and prevent women from actually generalizing their observations? Well, Wollstonecraft outlines these everyday mechanisms that make pleasure the entire business of a woman's life. We see this through a total obsession with novels, music, and poetry, things that inflame the passions but don't really form the judgment. We see it in the culture of gallantry, all those highly dramatic, trivial attentions paid to women that really just serve to insultingly prop up an illusion of male superiority. There's this intense focus on dress and finery over intellect, where thoughts are constantly hovering around personal appearance rather than any grander ideas.
And finally, marriage is pushed as the only viable way for a woman to quote-unquote better herself, which turns the whole thing into a calculation for societal advancement rather than an actual equal partnership. And that leads right into this infamous quote from the philosopher Rousseau, who said, "Educate women like men, and the more they resemble our sex, the less power will they have over us." Now, Wollstonecraft notes that she actually completely agrees with this idea, but her reasoning totally flips Rousseau's intent on its head. See, her ultimate goal is not for women to have manipulative, sensual power over men. Her goal is for women to have power over themselves.
It's a profound thought, and it really begs the question, do we still do this today? Do we still raise girls to prioritize being amenable and hyper-focused on aesthetics over being intellectually rigorous? Wollstonecraft was writing this back in the 1790s, but we really have to ask ourselves if these traps of sensibility, this intense focus on producing a sensation and managing appearances, still exist in our modern, completely image-obsessed era. Let's dive into Section 4, the aristocracy comparison. This is a really surprising parallel.
To prove that this degradation is all about societal conditioning and not some natural biological gender difference, Wollstonecraft draws an absolutely fascinating parallel. She argues that the entire female sex is kept in the exact same condition as the wealthy aristocracy. Think about it. Both groups are granted gratuitous privileges without any real effort. Both are expected to exhibit only what she calls negative virtues, things like patience, docility, good humor, flexibility, traits that are fundamentally incompatible with vigorous intellectual exertion. And both are ultimately ruined by unearned pleasure and a total lack of adversity. She points out that women, much like the rich, are localized by courtesy, completely insulated from the struggles that actually build strong character.
The parallels here are incredibly literal. When you prioritize frivolous accomplishments, the consequence is that true wisdom gets completely degraded. When you have a lack of industry and adversity, it results in enervated, weakened minds and bodies. And when you focus purely on elegance and manners, etiquette simply gets substituted for true virtue. Wollstonecraft points to historical figures like King Louis XIV of France. She notes that he established this despotism of manners, where he relied on a majestic step, a graceful shape, and a noble voice, rather than extensive knowledge, industry, or heroic valor. The aristocracy, exactly like the women of her era, relied on superficial traits to maintain an illusion of superiority.
She uses this incredibly vivid metaphor to drive the point home. When people are placed in a torrid zone with the meridian sun of pleasure darting directly upon them, they cannot brace their minds to discharge the duties of life. Without the necessity to struggle, both women and aristocrats just become prey to their own senses. They completely lack the impassioned thinking and calm investigation required to make great resolves. Pleasure literally becomes a stagnant pool that weakens them.
Finally, we reach Section 5, a foundation for virtue and the crucial need for intellect.
So, if the trap is sensibility and pleasure, what's the way out? How do we actually build a foundation for virtue? It all comes down to this one core belief. Without knowledge, there can be no morality. Ignorance is a frail base for virtue. The author is deeply persuaded that the heart, as well as the understanding, is opened by cultivation. Reason is absolutely necessary to perform any duty properly. You cannot have true virtue if you are merely acting out of blind obedience or some fleeting emotion. True virtue actually requires the intellectual capacity to understand why a moral choice is right.
The ultimate takeaway here is that when women are actually given an intellectual foundation, when reason is cultivated, the results are completely transformative. They become useful, respectable members of society rather than mere ornaments. They become capable of true domestic management and parenting, ruling their households with the steady eye of reason rather than spoiling children through this chaotic mix of tyranny and indulgence. They gain the ability to survive independently. Wollstonecraft heartbreakingly describes uneducated women left destitute, forced to eat the bitter bread of dependence on their brothers. And finally, cultivating reason means they are capable of forming deep friendships founded on principle and time, rather than jealous, fleeting, romantic passions.
This explainer forces us to hold up a mirror to the mechanisms of our own culture. If virtue truly requires reason, what happens when society only values our sensibility? Does a culture that elevates aesthetics, emotional reactions, and superficial accomplishments over rigorous thought ultimately degrade us all? I'll leave you with that provocative thought to ponder. How do we evaluate worth, intellect, and human potential in our society today? Catch you next time.